Welcome, everyone, to episode 5 of our Don Quixote reading group. We are covering chapter 4 of part 1 of Don Quixote. Um, I don't know if one of you would like to get us started off with, um, with a summary of what happens, because this chapter has two distinct episodes. Kia, I always appreciate your summaries. So would you like to summarize this chapter? Give us a nice synopsis.
Okay, I will try. Um, so yeah, he's Don Quixote is still at the inn briefly at the beginning of the chapter, but he's about to set off. And he's setting off on the basis of advice that he's been given by the landlord at the inn to go back home, get money, a shirt, and he's added like a squire to that list of things he needs to get. And then he kind of sets off on the journey, and he's not on the journey very long when he sees this terrible injustice that's going on, and there's a farmer that's beating a small boy, and you kind of hear their conversation, and the conversation goes something along the lines of, why'd you lose my sheep? And the boy's like, I'm so sorry, and I'll never do it again. And then the guy's beating him, and then um Don Quixote very nobly tries to interrupt this and says, no, you can't do this. And then they have a conversation, and then it comes out that the farmer hasn't been paying the boys wages, partially because of the missing sheep, or that's what he says. The and then it kind of goes on, and Don Quixote decides that the right thing to do is that the man should stop beating the boy because he's defenseless, and pay him his wages. And then also decides at some point that this guy's a knight. Like as he arrives, he's like, yes, you are a knight, and I'm going to treat you like a knight, and you clearly have the nobility of a knight. And so when the guy agrees and says, of course he'll pay his wages and whatever, then he's like, oh, of course you're a knight and you're noble, so you must act on your word. And so the boy is like, no, please don't do it. Is this too long a synopsis? Okay. The boy says, no, don't do it. And then like he's not a knight errant because he's from this place. And then immediately Don Quixote is like, no, he can be a knight from that place. There are knights from those places. And then yeah, so from there he's like, okay, he'll keep his word because he said he'll keep his word, and I'm gonna go off, and if he doesn't, then I'll punish him. So then they go off, and then the farmer starts beating the boy again. And yeah, so then Don Quixote feels like very proud of himself. He's done the great justice, and then of course there's that dramatic irony that we know he hasn't really done anything so great except probably make the situation worse. And then he kind of goes again onto his journey, and he starts moving forward. And then he comes across a crossroad, which I thought was quite interesting, where he like kind of sits at the crossroad, and he's like, oh, I'm a knight and I'm at my knight's crossroad. And then he kind of mimics the way the like knights in the stories would do, and he like really ponders what he should do, which I think is kind of funny because he already knows that he's supposed to be going home, but he ponders this, and then eventually he lets his horse decide, which is kind of a strange thing. And then the horse is just like, okay, I'm going to the stables. So then they head off, and then he comes across a group of traders, and then he decides this is his next adventure. He's going to try get these traders to declare how beautiful Dulcinea is, and they're amused because he's talking about knights and it's very weird and whatever. And then one of them, as wicked as he is, starts kind of playing into that whole narrative, and then kind of starts humoring him a bit, and then in the humoring process angers him because he doesn't say the right thing. Can I just sort that out quickly? I'm just a bit distracted by background noise.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know if someone else wants to continue while I just sort that out.
Basically, I can end off discussion is trickier. So then he ends up getting angered, and then he goes to sort of um, act upon his anger towards these merchants. But then he ends up incapacitating himself. And then he ends up on the ground and then he falls. And then I think I'm not quite sure, but I think one of the merchants, from my understanding, it's not someone who was in charge because later he got reprimanded by the other guy, but then he gets angry as well. Like he was quite hot-blooded, and then he ends up beating up Don Quixote when he's on the ground, and then afterwards, the other guy who was in charge said, "Hey, we need to go. We need to do things," and they leave Don Quixote on the ground, and then Don Quixote decides at the end that actually it wasn't his fault of the situation; it was the fault of his horse, and that's why he ended up on the ground, and they ended up hitting him.
Yeah.
So that's the synopsis of the.
Exactly, and it ends with Don Quixote completely unable to get up. I mean, it mentions that he wasn't able to get up, firstly because of his how heavy his armor was, and you wonder if there's something symbolic about that, that he can't carry the weight of being a knight on his own. That's an interesting idea. And then of course he can't get up the second time because he's been like beaten to a pulp. And yes, so that is the thank you for the synopsis, both of you. That's very detailed. As always happens, some things have occurred to me now in listening to that. So almost the role of protagonism that Rocinante assumes here, the fact that Rocinante is actually the one who kind of decides what happens in the second in the second episode, because not only does he decide to does he lead um, Don Quixote at the crossroads. He's also the reason that Don Quixote falls off of or isn't able to fight the merchants in the first place, which of course is probably a good thing. This isn't the first time, as I think both of you may know, because you have some experience with the upcoming chapters. This isn't the last time that we'll see Don Quixote fighting with travelers on the road, a group of travelers on the road. This is actually a recurring theme in part one. Not so much part two, for very good reasons, but in part one. General ideas of this chapter. I mean, if you were to kind of think of a single theme that stands out in this chapter, what would it be in your opinion? Here.
Um, I think the one theme is like the sense of justice that feels quite naive. And being the person to enact justice, but like from almost like a god-like perspective where the rules can change at any moment. And then I was kind of thinking of this passage that like when he's confronting the traders and he's like, well, if you need to see her, then what merit is it that you should just believe me? And it just like felt very reminiscent of like kind of biblical faith in him, and he's kind of like elevated himself to God in that kind of role of justice bringer, which I thought, at least that was a theme for me. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think you're touching upon something interesting. I mean, this hasn't escaped that part you've just spoken about hasn't escaped the attention of commentators. We have to, of course, read this within the context of an epistemological crisis that's occurring in Europe at the time, in European philosophy, and also the Protestant Reformation, right? Um, and so this whole question of belief and the technical term fideism, right? So this idea that initially French Catholic theologians formulate. Actually, not even theologians. In fact, they weren't generally theologians. They were more sort of philosophers. Formulate as a means of countering Protestantism, but eventually in the later 16th century and the early 17th century is adopted predominantly by Protestant Protestant controversialists is this idea that, in a sense, faith comes before reason. I want to discuss that a little bit later because that's a really interesting thing. I think in our sort of post-Enlightenment idea, in sort of our influenced as we are by the Enlightenment today, that's something that we immediately, like, it's very difficult for us to ever accept that as being legitimate. But if you start to think about how deep Pyrrhonist skepticism ran in the context of the time, you begin to understand a little bit where some of those thinkers were coming from. But I think I'd like to address that a little bit later because it's a really interesting, it's actually a very, very interesting topic. And it ties into what I think the two themes are here. One of them I share with you is the sense of justice, right? So this is very clearly Don Quixote for the first time entering society. So I think I mentioned before, and this really only struck me this time reading Don Quixote, is that we're seeing almost kind of like a history of humankind across his development in these past few chapters. But initially, it starts almost just with, well, if we were to fix the starting point at the moment that he decides that he's going to revivify the extinct order of chivalry. We start just with him, and there's like, he is representation of man, Dulcinea becomes representation of woman, Rocinante becomes representation of animals, and he's even given this kind of like almost Genesis-like role of like naming animals, right, and naming the things around him. He kind of decides the ontology, and then of course afterwards he leaves the castle. Well, the castle. He leaves his own little villa. Then he goes to the castle and he encounters like a larger set of society. And now for the first time he's even left that, what he thinks is a castle but is really an inn. And he encounters these problems of justice. So it is also interesting that we're seeing society get more complex as time goes on. And so yeah, I think that's and the corollary to that is that justice becomes the theme. And I think the second theme is also trust, because this is an interesting commonality between these two. He's asking the merchants to trust his word, that Dulcinea is the most beautiful woman in the world, and he's also trusting that I'm trying to remember the name of this particular of the herder. The boy is Andres, but the herder is Juan something. I can't remember. Let me look it up here. Juan Alduldo. Juan Alduldo is the name, and he has this degree of trust with Juan Alduldo, which is completely not merited. So those two are things I'd like to explore a little bit later. But before we elaborate on either of our points, Tudor, what do you see? I mean, if you were to try to distill this into a theme or two, what do you think it would be?
I think I know maybe it's not such an overarching theme, but I think it's more just the idea of like control and agency. I think like Don Quixote in this chapter, as his interactions with people, I think are like quite passive. So you realize that he doesn't necessarily have his interaction with people are just by talking with them, and in a way, then like he is like choosing to not get involved in any like decision making processes. Like, I'm not going to stop or intervene in the situation, besides just accepting, okay, that I trust the farmer. He won't continue beating the boy once they're back, and also then like trusting his horse to be the one who like leads and resolve the issue. And I think even in the end, I guess he just accepts what is going on, but then it's not because of something he's done. So he's sort of relinquished control, and was saying more to the situation that's like allowed him to end up in that state where he's beaten and can't move on the floor, instead of saying like these were my actions that I took. So I think for me it's like a sense of not being in control. I think is one theme that maybe stands out. The other one I think was more in line with like just justice, but like a very, I would say like physically violent form of like justice of the boy now getting beaten because of like the beliefs of the farmer of like what was wrong. So it was in a way serving like physically like disciplining him for what he's done. And then also like Don Quixote ending up in that position as well. I think it was interesting for me to see how he like was watching someone get beaten and then he ended up being beaten at the end of the chapter. So it was a bit interesting.
That's actually a brilliant point.
Yes.
No, that's a brilliant point. I never even thought of that. I never thought that there's the sense in which he ends up being that there's this parallel between Andres receiving the beating and Don Quixote being beaten up as well. Yeah, so that's actually quite a good point. I'm really interested in that, and I never thought either of these dynamics of kind of agency and trust in fate, in a sense, that you've pointed out. It's interesting that also there we see this kind of parallel. We see the situation where, I mean, symbolically, if you think about it, the chapter starts with Don Quixote on his horse, so he's in like a elevated position, and it finishes with him off, on the ground, unable even to get himself up, let alone undo injustice. I think the word they use in the Spanish is deshacer, tuertos or something like that. I'll have to check that again, but it's a very specific word that, interestingly enough, actually it's actually a term used in common law, in Castilian common law at the time. The language that Don Quixote uses when he's talking about enacting social justice are not, those terms are not just generic terms. They're actually terms that come quite specifically from Castilian common law. This has led some researchers to question if Cervantes actually had legal training. Now, we're quite certain that he himself never studied law, but we know that one of his uncles, or potentially his grandfather, one of his relatives was a lawyer, and Cervantes himself had a run-in with the law on at least one occasion. And so he had to actually be quite versed in the law in order to organize and orchestrate a defense of himself in court. So the language that Don Quixote uses there is very specific. And I wish I could comment on it with more expertise than I can. But I actually really like this idea that you've pointed out, just to return to it, the sense in which he starts out this chapter mounted on Rocinante with this idea that he's going out to enact justice. But already, by the time the second episode begins, it seems as though he's lost confidence in that. And that makes me wonder, does the fact that he surrenders to Rocinante, the agency, does that indicate that maybe he actually suspects that Andres that he actually hasn't enacted justice in the situation with Andres and Juan Aldudo? Then maybe he knows at like some level, yeah, Juan Aldudo is actually going to go back and beat up this boy. I never thought of it in that way before until you've pointed that out. Maybe that kind of explains the kind of passive, the sort of passive attitude he takes in the second episode.
I had an alternative theory with
Yeah.
that, but I think it's also just been like because of, I mean, it could definitely be that, which gives him, I guess, like a little bit more agency. But I guess with like this theme of stories being like the directors of agency, I think I saw it as this like more of a character that like didn't know what they wanted to do with their lives, and then started reading a bunch of books and literature, being like a proponent for direction, but that proponent having like a lot of holes in it. And so like he's like following the sense of direction as much as he can, but then there are these situations where he doesn't have direct directions. Like there's not going to be, the story isn't going to translate to a literal crossroads. He can't literally follow the crossroads. I thought of it more as like a blind spot of the schematics.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So maybe the sense is like the chivalric romances don't tell the knight what to do at the crossroads. You know,
Yes.
maybe that's the point. But they do tell the knight what to do if he finds a boy being accused of stealing sheep.
Yes.
Um, yeah, that's a
Yes.
good point. Maybe Tudor, unless you have something that you'd like to say generally about the chapter, I'd actually like to focus on this first episode because there are a few interesting things here. The first is Andres. Now, Andres the boy, there are some implications that actually he is guilty. Not too many textual implications, but contextual implications. Now, it's mentioned somewhere, and again, I wish I had the precise knowledge to point out the exact sentence here. So I'll just ask you, if you humor me, to trust in me. Um, uh, that that there's an indication that he is from Sevilla, and I think we mentioned before here that Sevilla has both a historical and a symbolic role in Don Quixote. It's the south of Spain, so it's almost like kind of the lower part, almost the inferno of of the country. It's also a port city, or right adjacent to a port city. And we all know that port cities are where commerce and interaction with the rest of the world takes place. And so that's naturally like this. It's a kind of a liminal space. It's a space in which sort of the identity of the center kind of breaks down somewhat, and it's a place of chaos. So it was also the place of the underworld in almost all Cervantine literature. So I know, Kia, you were quite
Mm.
keen on reading the, what were they? Cervantes's novelas ejemplares. And there's the famous novela
Mm.
ejemplare, there's the famous novela ejemplar about Rinconete y Cortadillo, the two boys who
Mm.
go in and they kind of participate in the Sevillan underground for a while. So Andres himself, there's indication, there's quite a heavy implication that he's actually experienced in the Sevillan underground. And so that lends some credence to Juan Aldudo's suspicions that Andres is actually stealing the sheep. So in this sense, Juan Aldudo is actually acting in injustice. I mean, obviously in 21st century terms, no one is like, we don't flog people anymore. But at the time, I mean, that was a fairly common punishment for something as simple as stealing. That's the first point I wanted to make. And then the second is another contextual element we have to read into this is that Don Quixote is, we've spoken about this beforehand, but he has a vision, an anachronistic vision of justice. So he has the vision of justice that is I want to say enacted, but in a sense distributed. I'm trying to find a more adequate term. But he has a sense of justice that is um, essentially medieval and is the justice which a lord ensures over his vassals. The time that we're talking about, already Spain had developed what we might consider kind of an early modern police system. Um, Obviously, I'm using fairly anachronistic language because police systems only really developed in the 19th century. But Spain had founded these hermandades, these brotherhoods, these sort of communities or fraternities that were in charge of ensuring local justice. Now, of course, we're still talking about the early modern era. This is before kind of post-Napoleonic state bureaucracy. So everything is on a very, like, everything still has to respect the principle of subsidiarity. Problems are dealt with more or less on their level of application and the level at which they arise. And so we're talking about very local hermandades. These aren't hermandades that would even take care of a whole county. These are hermandades that might take care of like a village. Um, but still, there is kind of like established at this point an official policing force. And Don Quixote is actually operating outside the boundaries of this official policing force. The Hermandad will come back, will recur throughout the rest of Don Quixote. In fact, Sancho Panza, who I think we meet next chapter, is constantly concerned about the Hermandad prosecuting uh, Don Quixote himself. But that's maybe that's a question for that's a topic that we'll elaborate on later. But I just want to emphasize here that actually even in this particular instance, Don Quixote is kind of acting outside of his time and place. Any comments about that point? Anything that you guys would like to add there?
I mean, yeah, I do think it is interesting to think of him as acting outside of the law. I think it like does kind of reflect that. And I think you were talking about like the kind of arriving on a high point and then ending on a low point. And yeah, I think that does kind of add to that whole thing, but more than that, it's his perception that's landing on the floor, but in the whole time morally he's actually being quite consistent. And potentially being consistently bad. I think it is also interesting, like but you only want to talk about this first episode.
You can link to the second if you find it convenient, yeah.
Well, I think the second episode mirrors the first episode
Yes,
in that
that's
there's like a perpetrator and a victim, and then like the sense of a justice that this is not the right thing. And so like you have the people on the horses in the second episode who are like, no, don't beat up the old man who's on the floor. And then there's the guy who's like, this man just tried to attack us, like I'm gonna have my retribution, and starts beating him up. And then in that scene, instead of being the guy on the horse, he is the person who's initially instigated the trouble, and he's causing the trouble in that one. So I think it is like it mirrors it in a way that makes you wonder if he caused the problem in the first place, even in the first episode, where you have like these three different roles in both episodes, but he could have been interrupting that justice, as you say.
Yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's quite perceptive. I didn't think of explicitly that these two episodes mirror each other, and but it makes sense. I mean, it's quite odd. It's quite an odd chapter in terms of its structure that we've got these two like almost um, hermetically sealed incidents. And I mean, usually each chapter deals with like one particular topic and then it moves on. But here we've got two within the space of one chapter. Yeah, Tudor, anything you'd like to say there?
I just had a callback to the earlier chapters, and I just thought it was quite funny that the one who knighted him was also from Sevilla, um,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So I thought it was quite funny, the link there. But yeah, I think no, I definitely see that, and I think it's interesting then also with what you were saying of like at what point, like whose justice is Don Quixote following? Mm. It's interesting to see because I think he definitely is like acting outside the realm of the police force, like you were saying, that would work at a more local level. But in the same way, I think like the farmer is also acting in his sense of justice, right? So
yeah.
it's just interesting to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Paul, I mean, the point that you raised there is interesting because the question is, I mean, if I've just spoken all about the foundation of the Hermandades, the beginnings of a kind of a police force in order to like ensure that I eliminate this principle of retribution, because that's actually largely what justice systems exist for, is actually to stop reciprocal retribution, and kind of interclan violence, right? Tit for tat kind of violence. Now, the question then is, why doesn't Juan, I mean, if he's so kind of certain that Andres has actually stolen his flocks, why doesn't he report this to a higher authority? Why does he take it upon himself to actually beat Andres? Especially given that, I mean, numerous historians have commented on just how litigious a society Spain was becoming at the time. I mean, Spain's major university, the University of Salamanca, was a university in which people predominantly were trained as lawyers. Major figures in Spanish history of this era were lawyers. Cortés himself, before he decided to go and conquer the Mexica, the Aztec Empire. I mean, his only training was as a lawyer. I mean, he hardly had any military experience. He had very limited military experience. So That's also another interesting point. Something I wanted to add about this regarding kind of regarding kind of legitimate authorities here is there's also potentially a commentary that Cervantes is actually making on the way law functions. Now, today, again, we live in this danger of anachronism. So we read back into the past assumptions that we share today. And today, when we see a law passed, the assumption is like, okay, everyone has to follow that law. Like, if Parliament in South Africa passes a law, then we know that the moment that that law is in effect, it's actually pretty, like, it's rare that a law isn't actually enforced, right? Almost all laws, when they're enacted, they're enforced, right? Now, the problem is that in a society before the railroad, before modern means of communication, before massive state bureaucracies, laws were published, they often weren't followed. I mean, if by and large, this is actually quite interesting because this is an error historians have often fallen into since the 19th century, is that they'll say so and so likely happened, or X was a social phenomenon in medieval France, because we see all these laws against it, or we see all these laws governing and regulating it. That doesn't actually mean, like, if the law said, I don't know, archers, everyone had to practice archery every Sunday after church, as was actually a law under Henry V in England, our assumption was often, oh, therefore everyone actually practiced archery for an hour after church on Sundays. But we don't understand that, like, the king, the law that he set in his courts, that wasn't necessarily followed. There was no way, or there's a very limited way, for the king to actually ensure that his law was being observed. So some readers have looked at this incident where Don Quixote tries to administer justice in the case of Andres, and then his subsequent kind of departure, as being one of those many instances in which a king will visit a commune. He'll visit maybe one of the sort of feudal states technically under his crown. He'll say, you guys aren't obeying X law, and he'll try and make sure that they obey X law, but then he'll move on to the next the next commune, or whatever it is, whatever polity we're talking about. And then the moment he leaves, then that particular portion of society is going to return to behaving the way they were. This, of course, was a big issue in the Americas, right? So in the Americas, the Spanish monarchy enacted sweeping reforms, right, to eliminate abuses, usually by the landowners, the hacenderos. But that doesn't mean that those were actually ever followed, right? That just means that's just an indication of royal will. That doesn't actually mean that those were ever enforced. It would have been very difficult to enforce something at such a great distance. Now, that I think is that also seems to be a commentary here. That also seems to be something that Cervantes is referring to. That the moment the king leaves, then when the cat's away, the mice will play, as they say, or the rats will play, however the saying goes. So that's also actually a point worthwhile making. Any comments on that, or do we feel ready to move on from Andres to the next point?
I forgot.
Okay. Well, please remind us as soon as it comes back to your mind. Please remind us about it. Tudor, anything you want to say about this first episode?
I think we covered it quite well. We explored it quite well in terms of justice and whose justice is being followed.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
also witnessing it. Yeah.
Sorry, you were saying.
No, of
And
course.
also there's people witnessing what's happening, and they also have a say, I guess, in it. So.
Mm. I did remember what I wanted to say. I thought like what you were saying about the law was interesting, in that there was this commentary about the law. But I think it's also like, because there is that kind of commentary on the law and like who's enforcing like what's right, there is also the sense of that there's like a lot of nuance in justice, that each individual in this thing has their own sense of justice. And so like justice itself is also being contrasted with law itself. if that makes any sense. I think that's a bit of a sweeping statement, but
Well, it could be this. I mean, I don't know if yeah, I'd have to think about the episode exactly to see if are you saying that like justice is ever contrary to law in in this episode?
um well, I think there is like I think what you were saying, like why if the farmer was being honest, then why didn't he like go to one of these enforcers kind of thing. um and then I was kind of thinking in contrast to that, like Don Quixote like operates on a sense of trust for the farm and he leaves based on that trust, but then the farmer says in the beginning that a sheep is disappearing every single day, and there is like that sense of like consistency. And then when you were talking about like the underworld in Sevilla and that being a link, then I'm like, oh, okay, are these sheep just like going straight to the underworld kind of thing? So it's like a bit of a jump, but that's kind of where my head went. So it was like, if he's interrupting like a sense of justice on a boy who's like literally a part of the underground, then yes.
Okay, yes, yes. No, no, I get your point. Yeah, no, that is a good observation. Yeah, that is a very good observation. Maybe what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to talk about trust there and use that as a segue into the next. So, something that interests me a lot is epistemology, right? So, and Don Quixote is a profoundly epistemological book, as makes sense, right? We know that what had happened is this is prior to the Protestant Reformation, and this is just prior to what we kind of incorrectly term perhaps the Renaissance, right? But we know that you have a whole body of literature, of skeptical literature that's rediscovered um, in private collections and in ecclesiastical collections in late medieval Europe, and opens this opens thinkers up to a whole slew of skeptical arguments, and of course things get quite extreme. I mean, we know there's this form of skepticism, Pyrrhonist skepticism, which is based on the writings of Pyrrho of Elis. I think he was from Elis. I may be getting his city state wrong, but essentially, it, there were some thinkers as a lot of the contemporary controversies started to reach boiling point, that put forward this idea that nothing can actually be known, that actually we can't know anything, that neither through empirical observation nor through rationalist um, thought exercises can we actually come to really know anything. Of course, the the two the two icons of those epistemological tendencies are on one hand Descartes, who comes up with this idea of uh, I think, therefore I am, right? That's a rationalist idea. So he's basing knowledge of his existence, certain knowledge of his existence, on the fact that he knows. He's conscious that he is thinking. And then on the other hand, you've got the major empiricist. Would it have been John Locke? Am I correct in saying that, Kia? Maybe you can correct me there.
Sorry, what was that word that came just before John Locke?
Empiricist. Would he have been sort of the iconic empiricist of the time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't say he's an entirely empiricist. He does have some weird ideas about perception. But like perceptions itself, he looks at perception itself, so I wouldn't call him exactly an empiricist.
Well, let's
I've
pretend that
just
there is, yeah. No, sorry, continue.
sorry, I was just trying to remember who the other one was. I'll think about it.
Descartes, yes, I'm thinking Descartes and Locke, but I may be getting my philosophers mixed up here. It's not Hobbes. Hey, I'm not. No, no.
It's not Hobbes, but the name has left my mind. I'm just gonna quickly, but
Please,
carry on. I'll bring it back maybe later.
yeah, please do. So essentially, we're talking about these kind of these extreme positions in epistemology, empiricism, rationalism, and empiricism. Um, and then I commented early on how this leads many to adopt fideism. So the argument essentially is this: we can't know anything. Okay, and because we can't know anything, that means that at some point, in order to actually live, right? Um, in order to actually live, we have to give credence to something. We have to like assert a belief about something in order to actually function day to day, right? And not and not and not get to the point where we're questioning everything to the extent that actually we paralyze our day-to-day interactions, right? And the solution to this problem was some thinkers adopted fideism, so this notion that faith comes before knowledge, and that faith pre-exists knowledge. Now, as I said, this was a position that ultimately became much more identifiable with Protestantism. Early on, we know a lot of French Catholics who were trying to combat Protestantism in France actually adopted this position. Um, I mean, it's actually a position which, although initially it appears truly ridiculous, it's something actually I think I can have a degree of understanding for. And the reason I say this is that even if we try and base everything we know in empirical observation or in well thought out rationalization, um, we can never allow that to be the vast body of our knowledge. I think the issue in the end of the day is that a huge portion of what we know comes just from trusting sources, right? I always like to use this argument. I mean, I don't know if either of you have ever visited the United States. Well, then, I mean, how do you know the United States is real? You know, it could be this like complete conspiracy, right? Well, the reason you do is that you know you've reached a point at which kind of the massive information coming into you leads you to believe that reasonably you need to assert the United States' existence, or at least tacitly accept the United States' existence, in order to believe that Donald Trump really is the president-elect of this particular country, right? Um, and of course we do that with the vast majority of what we know, right? A lot of what we know through trust. I mean, perhaps the most contemporary useful example of this is the Earth, right? So I don't think any of us have really conducted the empirical observations necessary to conclude that the Earth was round. But people have known that the Earth was round since antiquity. I mean, people knew it long before Columbus, right? It was generally accepted. And we generally accept it today. And if people don't believe that, well, you know, maybe 0.002% of them have some like really good arguments. But the point is that a lot of, well, in a sense, flat earthers have actually got a pretty good epistemological point, if in the sense that what they're saying is, well, you know, you've not carried out the empirical observation. You're just believing that the Earth is flat, right? I mean, I think it's ultimately self-defeating, because even then, your arguments for why the Earth isn't flat are going to rely. I mean, your arguments for why the Earth is flat are going to rely on a whole series of assumptions, a whole series of assumptions based on trust that you can make yourself. You can carry out the experimentation required. You can carry out the observation required to even conclude that the Earth is flat. So essentially, my point in the end of the day is trust is actually necessary. I mean, it's an absolute necessity for epistemology. It's an absolute necessity for knowledge. And I think I've rambled on a little bit about that. So I'll ground it in the text after I've heard your takes. If I don't know if you guys want to take this further and apply it to the particular episode.
No, I think you sent me a little bit in a different direction for a moment. I'll think about it. I don't know if Tudor has any.
Okay. Yeah, Tudor, anything to say?
I was just reminded about there was a point in time when there was a lot of like memes and things around Australia not being real, because it's like so different, and there's all these different kinds of animals there. And have you ever met an Australian? So
Yeah.
it was, I think, like that was done in like satire. But I think it's interesting when you think of it more in this way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the particular instance, of course, I'm referring to here in the text is that we see Cervantes in his very Cervantine way, like in one moment posing all of the kind of surveying all of the positions on a particular controversy. Because we've got Don Quixote, who rides up to these merchants, and he says to them, well, you must swear that Dulcinea is the most beautiful woman in the world. He uses a whole degree of hyperbole. I mean, going back to some of this irony, he calls her La Imperatriz de la Mancha, the Empress of La Mancha, which is kind of like, talking about an Empress of Randburg, or like a tiny
Benoni.
Yeah, Benoni. Maybe that's a good idea. That's actually a very, very good point. Yeah. So there's that.
You mentioned it before.
That's sort of the humor in it, right? But then the one merchant, and it's actually stated that he's got a sense of humor on him, right? He actually says, well, how could we claim that she is the most beautiful woman in the world if we haven't seen her? And so seeing here, of course, there's this empiricist. There's, on one hand, kind of like the Don Quixote is expecting of them this just trust in his statement as an authority figure, and then there's this desire to prove everything empirically. And so we see them canvass these positions. It's interesting, of course, that none of the other merchants want to engage in this because they see this as like a joke. So there's this kind of like meta-awareness of the problem, that it's not even, there are some controversies actually that genuinely aren't worth entering because you can't resolve them to any benefit of anyone involved. And it's kind of interesting. I wonder if the fact that everyone else in the context actually treats it as a joke is also a reference to this need for kind of like meta-awareness on any of these philosophical problems. That's just something that's occurred to me right now. But this, of course, is the particular instance I'm talking about when I talk about trust, and how trust is mirrored across these two episodes.
Yeah, I think there's like an interesting comparison because, like, on the one hand, like you were talking about the flat earth versus the round earth. So on the one hand, the travelers are looking for that like kind of empirical evidence that's like, okay, I want to see it with my eyes, and then I'll believe you. And that's the kind of evidence a flat earther would use. It's like the earth is flat because it looks flat. And so to have like a more kind of he's not rational, but he's appealing to ideas of knowledge rather than like perceptions of like rather than perception. And that kind of being like that kind of knowledge, the one that's like harder to prove, is the knowledge that we trust more. Like people don't need to know that the earth is like, they don't need to understand the math around the earth being round or the rotations around the sun to believe it, because they're like, okay, there are people who are smarter than me. And that's the kind of epistemology he's appealing to as well. So it's like, if we're going to take him to be a fool, then it is kind of being pointed back to us in some way as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's this interesting thing of us relying on people who are smarter than us. Well, the issue is people who are smarter than us can make huge mistakes. I mean, this has happened so many times in history, right? To devastating consequences. So there's no real easy solution to this problem of, I mean, I find that things are quite like really simple, like quite brutish when you get to the end of it. And sometimes the very best thing is you just trust in what's told you. As terrible as that sounds, because that's so contrary to kind of so much of the Enlightenment project, right? Which for better or for worse, is always questioning what has been told. But the issue is that the reliance on authority and trust just will never. It's so much part of human nature that we actually can't ever escape it. Tudor, anything you want to say on that?
I think what's interesting for me is there's also a level of, already within these claims, taking it back to the text, it's sort of, we have an overarching view of, we understand Don Quixote, we understand his relationship with saying, this is the most beautiful woman that you would ever set your eyes upon. But I think what's interesting here is they don't have that information of like the reality of the fact that even like Don Quixote, this person that Don Quixote is speaking about doesn't actually exist, right? But I think there's a level of, for me, it would be interesting is that there's a point maybe this person exists, but she is not the most beautiful person. She's not an empress, right?
Yeah.
So I think what's interesting, like I think more from a personal view when I'm reflecting on this, is that sometimes you trust people will make like sweeping grand statements, but we implicitly like maybe because there's this need to trust, like you say, in order to understand things, there's an implicit sort of trust on just a small level of saying, okay, that's maybe someone who does exist. Like if a country doesn't exist, someone says that, or like something, you're like, okay, for example, right? But there's this initial small level of belief in what's being said, which I thought is quite interesting.
That's actually super interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, that is super interesting. Is like, it's very difficult for us sometimes to, and I see this even. I mean, this is also a very personal thing, right? Which is when you're reading journal articles, for example, or you're looking up Wikipedia for some footnotes. Often it doesn't occur to you to think, well, actually, maybe the article is completely wrong. Like, it's not just wrong in this little argument. Like, almost everything it's saying is completely wrong. And that can happen. And but it's something. But there's, as you say, there's almost this instinct to trust in general, to like give a degree of general trust, and then maybe not see not extend that trust to every single article of that's being propounded. And yeah, that is a very that's a very apt observation there. A very, very apt observation, I think. I don't know if either of you have any closing remarks. The session's been a bit shorter than normal, which I think I'm glad for, because it's just about enough time for us to explore the essential points. Anything that you guys would like to finish off with? Seems like no.
I think maybe to finish off, it's going to be interesting to see, I think, this level of like justice and agency once, like you say, in the next chapters, once we start engaging with like the fear of other people's justice later on.
Yeah.
So we will see with the I forgot the name now, but the justice system at the time of Spain, with those local police forces, how there's this relationship of like Don Quixote to them, to common people, because I think now it's quite clear this distinction between the two in terms of like how Don Quixote sees himself of enacting justice, of being sort of above the law. But once there's that possibility of him being on the opposite side of the law, I think it adds an interesting element. So it'll be interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely it will. And now that you mention that, of course, it's really clever of Cervantes to have given us these first 4 chapters just to explore the character of Don Quixote. He sets up a lot about the knight himself, because next chapter, I believe next chapter is when we're introduced to Sancho Panza, and and we need to know a lot about Don Quixote before we can start looking at other characters. Kia, anything you'd like to finish off with?
I think I think it was just interesting. I felt like empiricism did play a big part in this chapter, but I think I'm like definitely in later chapters it smacks you in the face in a lot more obvious way. So it's interesting to see that like golden thread, and I'm curious to see how those ideas develop. But yeah, it's been very interesting. Thank you.
Fantastic. No, thank you both of you. We will then reconvene for discussing chapter 5, which I'm really looking forward to. Thank you both for your time. Thank you to anyone who is watching us. We appreciate that a lot. And I think until then, I will say adios and yes, have take care, everyone.